If this election's particularly close, we could end up with a hung parliament. In that case, the balance of power is likely to be held by three existing independent MPs, Rob Oakeshott, Bob Katter and Tony Windsor. It's also possible independents or minor parties could win other seats. For example, the Finance Minister, Lindsay Tanner's retiring in Melbourne, a seat the Greens are targeting. So how exactly will the independent MPs already in the Parliament act if none of the major parties wins an outright majority? And what are voters in their seats most concerned about this election? Joining me tonight from Tamworth is Tony Windsor. He's held the federal seat of New England in New South Wales since 2001, taking in a chunk of the northeast of the state, including Armidale, Glen Innes and Tenterfield. And Bob Katter's with us from Townsville. He's a former National Party minister who turned independent in 2001. He's been the member for Kennedy since 1993, taking in a huge chunk of North Queensland, including Mount Isa, Charters Towers and Innisfail. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks, Lee.
Good evening, Lee.
Good evening. I'd like to start by asking you both to nominate the three greatest concerns in your seat around this election. Tony Windsor, let's start with you.
Well, health is always the number one issue, and is again this election. I don't think anybody has to do any polling to look at that. Broadband runs a very close second in this electorate, in my view, and some of the water issues are very significant, not only in terms of local water issues, but the Murray-Darling system, those water issues, and the interface of mining and groundwater and surface water in relation to the Murray-Darling as well. And
when you say health, do you mean access to health services, waiting lists? What exactly?
Well, all of the things that have been common right across Australia. We've been very fortunate here. A medical school has been developed in recent years, so there's a glimmer of hope in terms of the future in relation to training long term of doctors and allied professionals, but that's been long overdue. There's also the issues of access to doctors, specialists, etc. But we're hopeful that some of those issues may well be addressed if we get the broadband thing right.
And I'll come back to that broadband thing in a second. Just let me ask, first of all, Bob Katter, what about in North Queensland, where you are? What would you name as the three biggest issues?
We've had a series of meetings with our close-knit supporters, and I was quite amazed at just how serious the health issues are, and I joined Tony in saying probably the leading issue. Two people turned up, one in Babinda and one in Richmond, that had to actually extract their own teeth. The services just are not there. So I'd say health services. I was very surprised to find electricity and rates. People are just finding it hard to make ends meet. That was a major issue that kept coming up all of the time. Obviously, the mining tax closed one of our big mines and put hundreds of people out of work. I mean, we would be very worried if that was to raise its ugly head again. But really, it's the go-forward aspect that I think that we people in North Queensland are most concerned with. And you've got to understand that government decisions closed down the fishing industry in North Queensland, 2,000 jobs gone. They closed down the timber industry, 2,000 jobs gone. They closed down the tobacco industry, 2,000 jobs gone. They've closed down half their deregulatory policies, have closed down a significant proportion of sugar, 1,000 jobs gone, and a significant proportion of dairy, 1,000 jobs gone. Now, I mean, a continuation of these policies, call them free market, call them economic rationalism, call them what you like, but I most certainly would always have identified Peter Andren and Tony Windsor and Rob Oakeshott as economic nationalists, not economic rationalists. But those policies have closed manufacturing. They are collapsing agriculture throughout Australia. All of agriculture is going down the decline at a very rapid rate of knots.
Well, let me ask you, sorry,
Mr. Potential. We do have water, and we can develop our water resource.
I'll come to water in a second. Let me just firstly pick up, though, on the broadband issue that Tony Windsor raised. Is that something of concern to people where you are too?
Yeah, except, you know, I mean, we're pretty happy that it's being addressed by the current government. Now, whether there's an extravagance issue in there or not, that's some fine-tuning that has to be looked at. But all I'm saying is that, you know, the cavalry's on its way. I've seen the cables being laid in Mount Isa.
And Tony Windsor, you raised that, you know, as a very significant issue in your seat. Do you have a preference for one or other of the major parties' policies on broadband?
Well, I think the last decade we've seen various commitments made by both persuasions of government in relation to telecommunications, and most people, quite rightly, are fairly cynical about this issue as well. So I don't actually believe either of them, but what I think has to happen if we really want to negate distance as being a disadvantage of living in the country, if we really want to look at some of these sustainable population issues in our major cities, we've got to get the broadband thing right. And I think there are attempts being made to get it right. But if we want to be internationally competitive in agriculture and a whole range of other industries in Australia, we've got to stop the nonsense that we've put up with for 10 years on telecommunications and get on with this. If there was ever an issue where, from a regional perspective, where we need the two major parties to actually come together and agree on something, this is it. But we've seen this game being played where various commitments are being given, some with not a great deal of planning, others with virtually no planning at all. But country people want to be internationally competitive and they want to have equity of access to these services.
Well, how about on water? I know everyone's waiting to see the Murray-Darling Basin Authority report, but what do you make, Mr Windsor, of what you're hearing from the major parties on water so far?
Well, I think there's some encouragement from both sides that are recognising that if water is to be removed in certain sections of the Murray-Darling for the greater good, the public good, that water be compensated. There's slight differences in terms of how that would be done, but essentially both the Labor Party and the Liberal Party are saying that they would enter the market and buy up water licences or water entitlements where they are available. So that's not confiscation as occurred at the state level, and that's a positive. But what's not being addressed, and I don't know whether the Murray-Darling Basin Authority have actually gone to the nub of this either in their report, is the impact on various communities. And the target marketing at the current government's level of buyback of water entitlements really hasn't addressed some of the significant issues of impact on local communities.
And what do you think about that, Bob Catter? Has there been substantial attention paid to that?
Look, you've got to understand that what is happening here in Australia, if the independents get the balance of power, is that democracy is being restored. You say instability, or you didn't, but other people have said instability. No, just the opposite is true. It's not instability, it's democracy. Every other country on earth that I know of anyway has a multi-party system. There's not just two sides to the argument, and in Australia they're both the same. I represent more than half of Australia's water runoff, the Kennedy Electorate. I mean, with just 7% of that water in North Queensland, all of North Queensland, and 2% of our land in North Queensland. I know people will not believe this when they hear this. We can support a population of 60 million people. Now, if we haven't got a population of 60 million, we can make a lot of money by selling that product overseas. That's just 2% of the land. Now, why isn't it being opened up? Why isn't some of those resources being used? And there's just no way out except to say it is immoral to sit on those resources when your nearest neighbour has 80 million of their population going to bed hungry overnight. Is just simply immoral. Well, and it won't be allowed to continue. There's no question about that. So what we are saying to you, there is a different paradigm out there. There is a paradigm of developmentalism and vision that this country has lost. You just develop a little tiny bit of those resources. Now let me give the government credit, and let me give the opposition credit here as well. On the North Australia Clean Energy Corridor, this electricity grid, energy grid, and there's clean energy all the way along this grid that will be just magnificently cheap into the foreseeable future, and it will enable us to open up our huge mining provinces that we can't for lack of infrastructure.
So, Bob Catter, can I ask then, given this issue about a big Australia,
we haven't actually built infrastructure.
I'm sorry to cut you off, but can I ask you, this issue of a big Australia, it's something that's, exercised a lot of people during the campaign. It's something that worries people in big cities, having more people come because they worry about infrastructure. Are you saying that in your region you actually want more people?
We don't want them to go to the cities. We want to take some of the people out of Sydney and Melbourne and put them where they can have a civilised lifestyle, which we can provide for them in Australia. I mean, if you drop a series of hydrogen bombs from the back of Cairns, the other side of Mareeba, 30 kilometres from Cairns, all the way across to Broome, you won't kill anybody. There's nobody living there. I mean, there's about 95% of the surface area of Australia, just cut out the little coastal strip and a little dot around Perth, the population is not much different than when Captain Cook arrived. There's only 670,000 people living on 95% of the surface area of the country. And I mean, we're talking about overpopulation. I mean, the rest of the world must really laugh at this. I mean, but the concept of developmentalism, the concept of a vision where people can live in a civilised city of 40 or 50,000 people, that seems to have been lost completely. And it's got to be restored. And the people will restore it. You know, please God.
Well, how will the people restore it?
That balance of power.
Well, I'll come to that balance of power issue in a second. Let me just ask one more question before I do. Tony Windsor, during this campaign, we've heard a lot from commentators and from some voters that the campaign's been short on substance, that it's lacked vision. What have you made of the campaign?
Well, I think it's been the worst political campaign that I've ever seen. I think both leaders